Tonight, we are excited to have a return speaker, Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant, who has been conducting archaeological that if you have an Epson printer and you take these 200 cartridges, here's a free box of printer cartridges. Come up to the table and get them. If you want them, come get them. Doing all kinds of stuff tonight, you know.
They're unopened.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the November presentation of Time Sifters. I'm Smitty, your president. We're excited this year. We have two fantastic holiday gifts available. The first is this beautiful Time Sifters polyester I'm wearing. And it's really comfortable. It's really nice. I really love it. They are very comfortable, and they're machine washable, and they're great to play golf in. They're available in the sizes small, medium, large, extra large, and triple X, double X, and cost $40 plus $3 shipping. We also have over on the table our very famous, world famous Time Shifters t-shirts. They're $15, and they're available in the same size ranges. You can pick up a t-shirt tonight, but you have to order the shirts. If you order them by November 25th, 28th, you'll get them by December 16th. And as you can see, cool stuff. We got so much stuff up here. As you can see, we have a fantastic lineup of presenters this season. Be sure to check out the webpage for any updates or additions. We're taking a break for the holiday season during December because 6 of us Time Sifters are going to Egypt for 13 days. The tour is led by our very own Steve Dörfler and should be really great. We'll have plenty of photos when we get back in January. Also, to our guests, if you like what Time Sifters is doing, please sign up as a member to help us continue bringing these types of wonderful speakers and their work to the awareness of the public. Speaking of travel, we have a travel committee now, and we're putting together some tours. And we'll let you know as soon as we get our act together on that. But looks like maybe a trip to Israel, maybe a trip to England, southern England, or Sicily. We've got a bunch of stuff on the table. We're really in the formula stages right now. We'll let you know. This is the one we're really excited about. We're teaming with OSHA Lifelong Learning Academy, known as OLLI, to offer the in-depth series. These are day-long presentations where we dive into the subject and get down to the nitty-gritty. The first one will be on the Dead Sea Scrolls and will be presented by Steve Dörfler. It will cost $98, which also includes lunch. Each of you should have a copy on your table, on the chairs, of the catalog. In that catalog on page 30 something.
That's specific.
Looks like 26.
26, like I said, 26. No, it's 30. I was right. Page 30 tells you how to register. You have to register through Lifelong Learning. The catalogs you see on your chair. If you want a description of the course, that is back on page 44. Lifelong Learning in Time Sifters in-depth series, The Dead Sea Scrolls, at the bottom of the page, describes the course. You have to, registration begins December 4th. Okay? It's a day-long class. It's be held over at Beth. There you go, thank you. Over on Bahia Vista and Tuttle. And it'll be day long. It's going to be a fantastic class. I'll be there. If you have any questions, you can talk to me afterwards on that. Coming up this Saturday, Spanish Point.
Not this Saturday.
No, coming up this Saturday, December 3rd. Who edited this stuff? Well, is it the 8th or the 3rd? 8th. Okay, December 8th at 1 o'clock at Spanish Point. Dr. Uzi Baran from New College is going to be presenting Heritage in an Age of Rising Sea Levels, Archaeological Perspectives on the Anthropocene. Should be a good one. Is that the same one you gave here?
A little better.
Okay, good. Things have changed, the levels have risen. And if you want more comedy, coming in January, yours truly will be presenting the Archaeology Year in Review, which will include the latest World Heritage Sites and some really cool things that have been discovered this year. Come join us. Tonight, we are excited to have a return speaker, Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant, who has been conducting archaeological research in Florida since 2005. He is currently a visiting lecturer at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Tonight, he will talk about Rosewood, Florida, which was once home to a prosperous African American community until its violent destruction in 1923. The event remained cloaked in collective amnesia until 1990s. This presentation describes work to update previous research via a mixed methods approach combining historical archaeology, documentary research, and oral testimony. This interdisciplinary approach continues to provide new information, including regarding the lives of those who lived in the area prior to Rosewood's destruction. The presentation will discuss recent work funded by the Florida Department of State, as well as ongoing work with digital technologies to support public outreach in the area and beyond. Please welcome Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant. I have to change your presentation. Computers only like one presentation at a time. Good.
Looks good to me. Oh, I forgot to change something there. Son of a... Don't ignore this. Obviously, I did change this talk. I just didn't change this part here, so it looks like I'm being lazy. I assure you, I am plenty lazy, but not in regards to the content of this talk. So yeah, tonight I'm going to get off. Here we go. Am I in frame? Do I need to move? I'm good. Okay. Can you pick my voice up? Yep, okay, good.
If you could speak into the microphone a little more. Most of us are of a certain age, and we've lost some of our hearing.
That's fine. I've lost some of my hearing too. Is that working?
Very little.
How about, no. How about that? Is that better? Yes. Okay, I'll just talk like that. I love the sound of my voice, and so will you. Okay. If I start to drift off and get quiet, just tell me. I don't have any problem talking. I'm a mover when I talk, so please bear with me. So yes, thank you for having me back here in Sarasota. I think it's been 2 or 3 years since I was here to give a talk. I really enjoy this. Obviously, I give talks around the state for different chapters of the Florida Anthropological Society. You guys always fill a room. This must be one of the more active groups in the state. So thank you. It's a big honor to be asked back. So tonight, as the great introduction mentioned, I'll be discussing Rosewood, Florida. So this was an African-American community, which obviously no longer exists, or at least the town they lived in no longer exists. The descendants of the community obviously still live around Florida, and I'll briefly touch upon that towards the end of the talk. So here's just a few of the things we're going to talk about today. I'm going to try to cram a lot into the next 40 or 50 or so minutes. So we'll see if we get away with that. For those of you who don't know where Rosewood is located. This is sort of the Big Bend area, the Emerald Coast. It goes by different names, probably 3 or 4 hours north of here, right on the coast. So if anybody's ever been to Cedar Key or that part of Levy County, that's where we're talking about. This site, Rosewood, is about 8 to 9 miles from Cedar Key, so right near there. So we'll go ahead and just jump into the history, right? I guess first I'd like to start, how many people, and don't cheat, there's nothing, no prize for knowing this, but how many people have heard of the site of Rosewood beyond like a brief mention before tonight? Oh, great, excellent. Obviously, that is an uncommonly high percentage of people raising their hands. So the history of Rosewood is actually much longer and more complex than a lot of people realize. So the town itself is actually settled following statehood in the 1850s, and by the Civil War there's a number of primarily white settlers in the area. Then following the Civil War and economic hardships that sort of mirror those at the national level by the 1890s, this opens the way for additional African American migration into the area, so that by the late 1890s and really the turn of the last century, the town has become majority African American. Probably 90% or so out of what would have been maybe 150 to 200 people would have been African American. Some of the white families remaining, others leaving. So that by the turn of the last century, you have a town where African Americans are owning their own homes at percentages that are far greater than locally, regionally, or nationally for African American communities. We'll see that actually probably plays part of the explanation for why Rosewood was targeted for violence in 1923. Throughout the 1900s, the 1910s, Rosewood continues to grow and prosper. I wouldn't ever say that Rosewood was a wealthy town, right? But it's certainly prosperous in the sense that you have people who are able to own their own business, own their own homes, educate their children, educate the children until they're much older than a lot of their neighboring communities were doing, right? So prosperous in the sense that they had access to home ownership, property, education at far greater rates than their neighbors. Then, of course, by the late teens and early 20s, we start to see something that seems to happen every decade or so in the state, land speculation, rapidly increasing land prices. And this, right, we think of this as being concentrated in South Florida and elsewhere, but it's actually happening all across the state. We see economic interests even reach into these very rural areas with industrial companies buying up land and so on and so forth. So that by 1920, as the neighboring community of Sumner, which is just about a mile down the railway tracks, as that's beginning to economically eclipse Rosewood because of a large sawmill factory that's put there, we start to see this rampant land speculation take hold. And so, of course, this is the setting for 1923 when New Year's Day, 1923, so that's a Monday, January 1st, we have a local white woman in the neighboring town of Sumner named Fannie Taylor report an attack to the sheriff. And this is a real thing, right? She was actually attacked. Now, what differs here, of course, right, is who attacked her. There are claims that it is a white man who attacked her, and there are claims that there is an African-American man who attacks her. So, of course, initially, many of the local white residents believe that this is a black man, right? And this is a convenient lie that Fannie Taylor probably herself told to hide injuries she sustained in what other oral histories have pointed out is likely an extramarital affair. Obviously, the point to bring this up is not to shame any family or their descendants, but to set the context for what follows over the next few days. So this assault incites local whites, right, including the sheriff, who proceed to try to track down this assailant. They go to neighboring Rosewood. The first home they encounter is actually Sam Carter. Sam Carter is the longtime blacksmith, longtime resident of Rosewood, and they interrogate him, asking him, where is this black assailant? Now, of course, Carter can't give them the answers they seek, partly because it's not a black assailant. He tells them multiple times, this is a white man who I helped leave the area. And so when they cannot provide, when Carter cannot provide these answers, he's actually further interrogated and they hang him by the neck from a tree while they interrogate him, and eventually shoot him multiple times, killing him, and they leave the body on the road in between Rosewood and Sumner, where it's found the next day. Now, the violence sort of subsides for a couple days, and this is partly because, and I'll talk about this later, partly because likely weather. A large rainstorm moved into the area that would have dumped the same amount of rain in a 24 to 36 hour period that would normally be dumped in a 1 to 2 month period. It's a torrential downpour, right? And we'll actually see weather events like that have halted these sorts of racially motivated violent events elsewhere. So eventually, whites, for various reasons, local whites, likely unsatisfied with the events of Monday, for instance, not finding the assailant, return to Rosewood. They target now the home, the Carrier home, and remember that name, because we're going to come back to that. Where these things, these residences are positioned on the landscape is really important for making sense of how the mob selected victims, why the mob went to specific places and not others. So remember this name, Carrier, right? There is a pitched gun battle at the Carrier household starting Thursday morning. This carries on for probably a day or so, with Sarah Carrier and one of her sons dying from gun-inflicted wounds. Also, 2 whites who were there attacking receive injuries that later lead to their death. So these are all people who are counted in the death toll or numbers for Rosewood. Eventually, a pair of brothers from nearby Cedar Key bring a train through the area. Violence is obviously continuing to magnify. They bring the train through the area. They pick up women and children so they can take them to nearby towns. And the thought was they wouldn't take men because they were worried if they were found that having men on the train would lead to further violence. They felt they could safely transport women and children to nearby towns where, over the 20th century, those families continued to live and their descendants live to this day. So places like Archer, in Gainesville, all the way up to Jacksonville where the train ended. By Friday, James Carrier returns to bury the bodies of his mother and brother. The mob apprehends him while he's doing this and proceed to kill him as well. So remember this aspect too. This is taking place in the African American Cemetery in Rosewood, and that's going to be a site that I talk about where we've been doing a lot of archaeology work in the last few years. Eventually, by Saturday and Sunday, the mob has grown, likely fed with further numbers from a large Ku Klux Klan rally in Gainesville over New Year's Eve weekend. This was actually the largest Klan rally in the southeastern U.S. that year, and it attracted participants from as far away as Georgia and Alabama, which obviously in 1923, that's a bit of a travel to participate in something like that. So this mob, reinforced by these additional participants, proceeds to burn every black-owned business, building, church, home, so on and so forth in Rosewood, and they violently, displace the African American community, who never returned to the area, A month or so, a little over a month later, a state grand jury is convened and actually finds insufficient evidence, And this is sort of a classic phrase used at the time. The grand jury basically states that these deaths and the violence that was associated with them occurred at the hands of persons unknown, which is, of course, a complete and total lie. Everybody knew who participated in this at the time, and that's going to be something we talk about when we sort of think about how do we theorize something like this a little bit. I think it's always useful to sort of think about those sorts of things. So when we're thinking about racial violence in American history, and this is part of a much broader tradition, which I certainly was unaware of when I began this research almost 15 years ago now. Obviously, this is part of a much broader trend. It's sort of painfully tragic, I guess, when you look at how common these sorts of events really have been, and not just in the American South, but really all across the U.S., particularly race riots. Rosewood is a race riot location is actually sort of an anomaly. The vast majority of race riots took place in northern locations, urban contexts. Obviously, lynchings, as far as we know, did occur. That would be sort of the extra-legal murder of someone, did occur in greater frequency in the South. So the sort of urban-rural divide that has characterized these two regions did not mean either region escaped racial violence. So when I think about racial violence, when I was first examining this literature, a number of things sort of stood out and really troubled me, right? And this is not like a dig at other disciplines. I have just as many digs to level against my own academic discipline as sociology or history. But it's typically sociologists and historians who are looking at race riots and lynching as a scholarly topic. And they tend to treat the causes, the factors leading to these sorts of events in really strange and what we would call one-dimensional or overly deterministic ways, right? So things like, well, the price of cotton is volatile and now we don't have as much money for our cotton crop, and that really upsets me, so the solution is to destroy the African American community next door. There's a few steps there, I think, that are missing, and obviously for the purposes of a public talk, I am reducing that a little bit, but these are the sorts of things, right? They're really looking for causal factors, and I think looking at this sort of research, 130 plus years of this type of research from the benefit of the present is, I think what's motivating a lot of it is a desire to sort of apologize for the past, right? And sort of try to find a way, look, there's nothing rational that can explain this, right? The behavior of the mob is irrational. These are crazy, feverish events that take place. I think when we start to look at these events through this interdisciplinary lens, using different data sets in conjunction, we're going to see that these mobs they behaved in anything but an irrational or manic or feverish. They actually behaved in very intentional, very strategic ways, which of course, right, suggests a much darker aspect to this history in America, right? So one of the ways that I have thought through this is to look at different types of violence, right? So obviously we live in a day and age where racial violence is not absent. We know it still exists. But we also know that the forms it has taken change over time, right? So I have borrowed, I guess a metaphor would be one way to frame this, from Black feminist thought and the concepts of intersectionality to sort of look at how do different types of violence interact across time and across space. And we're going to see that these patterns of violence change, but they change in related ways, right? So when we start thinking about violence, we'll have three different types of violence we'll talk about briefly. Interpersonal violence is the first one. This is what we typically think of when you hear the word violence. This is face-to-face violence. This is hands-on another person violence, right? So lynching, right, which most of us associate with sort of hanging, right? But lynchings involved all manner of method, right? And basically what unites them is they're extra-legal. These are citizens sort of killing other citizens without or outside of the purview of the legal system, right? And it happened all across the country, but obviously with with greater frequency here in the southeastern U.S. But we can also see even as lynchings reach their apex in the 1890s, and start to trail off so that by the 1900s, teens, into the 20s and 30s, it looks like lynchings are stopping, right? But what this chart doesn't show is what these lynchings became, right? They're not just solitary events with a handful of people. They literally become carnivalesque. They become festivals of violence, so that an individual who is going to be lynched is actually held by private citizens against their will for days, while train companies and newspapers literally get more people involved. Right? Newspapers run advertisements. Train companies add additional cars to their trains, and city centers swell with these individuals. A thriving postcard industry develops chronicling these events. Souvenirs are taken from the bodies of the people killed. So the numbers drop, but their intensity, their violence escalates rapidly, right? So this is, when we think about lynchings, if you were just going to take the number of lynchings, right, that suggests that racial violence is on the downward decline at this time, but that's not the whole story. So we also need to think about other types of events, right? So race riots are another example. And really, I'm sort of concentrating on a 5-year period here following World War I into 1923 when Rosewood happens. This is a particularly volatile period in American history for race relations. So, of course, we have well-known race riots at the time, starting with the East St. Louis riot in 1917, where the National Guard are actually called in to stop the rioting, which is basically, in this case, whites rioting against African Americans. The National Guard does arrive, but then starts to participate in the rioting themselves, right? Chicago, 1919, again, another week-long episode. These are not short events. African Americans and others in Chicago clash. This actually starts when a black adolescent boy accidentally swims into the white side of the beach in Chicago, and a white man throws rocks at him to get him out of the area, hits him in the head, and he drowns. The police do nothing, and this sort of ignites tensions that were already sort of gathering around economic strife in the city, strike breaking and stuff like that. Omaha, Nebraska, 1919, the crowd becomes so incensed that when the mayor steps forward and tries to stop them apprehending an African American, they actually hang the mayor from the county courthouse. Now, he actually escapes and survives this event, which ends when an enormous storm rolls into the area and stops all violence. In Omaha, it didn't reignite. It didn't start anew. And then, of course, Tulsa, 1921, 40 blocks of what was known locally as Little Africa, but known to the residents as Greenwood, come under fire literally to the point where local whites are chartering planes and dropping incendiary devices on these homes literally from the air, right? It is literally an all-out war. Now, of course, when we think about this, right, I don't want us to think that it sort of ended then. It didn't. Race riots have continued throughout American history, right? And many of them actually look like events or have causes sparking them that would resonate in the present, right? Things like police officers killing unarmed adolescent minority children, sometimes as young, right, as 6 or 7, or as old as 12 or 15. Many of these events actually start because of those sorts of events, right? And obviously those sorts of things are still taking place, and various communities are having to respond to them in the present. Now, we're going to switch to what we would call structural violence, right? Or systemic violence. So how is the structure of society oriented to disenfranchise different communities, in this case on the basis of race? So we can look at a couple different practices or movements, as some people refer to them, things like the Sundown Town movement. So this is a really good book on the topic. It's probably twice as long as it needs to be. My book probably is as well, but I hope not. It's actually not that long. But Sundown Towns, this was a movement to either create all white towns or make one's town all white by violently displacing any local minority population. And it's not just targeting African Americans. It actually starts as a movement in the West, places like California and Oregon, targeting Hispanic and Asian, particularly Chinese communities. It spreads to the Midwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, and actually reaches its apex around 1970, right? In places like Illinois and Indiana, where these communities were still being created or transformed through various practices. And of course, we see this sort of stuff carry on or get supported by things like redlining and all of these other practices that have received additional attention in recent decades. Now, there's also symbolic violence. And this is sort of the violence that takes place in people's imaginations, right? So this may not be face-to-face or structural, but it embeds in people's consciousnesses, in their imaginations, ideas of inferiority attached to racial difference. So of course, if you know anything about the history of Hollywood, you know race played a huge role in Hollywood for better and for worse, usually for worse, much worse. So you have films like D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, right? A technological marvel when it's released in 1915, but also single-handedly rekindling the Klan, right, which had been outlawed in this country in the 1870s by an act of Congress, is reborn when The Birth of the Nation is shown, right? And of course, the way African Americans are represented in this film is horrible. They're basically hypersexual thugs roaming the countryside, particularly men looking to despoil innocent white women, right? This gets sort of a scientific booster shot from the eugenics movement, right? Which then says, particularly in the Southeast, this is a very good book on eugenics in the Deep South, which was different than eugenics in the Northeast or eugenics in the Far West, where it survived for much longer. But basically said, right, in the Southeast, the African American race is already irredeemably degenerate. And so in fact, because of anti-miscegenation laws, the eugenics movement has less of an effect in some ways in the Deep South than it did in places like the Northeast or out West. But eugenics conversations, we have forgotten this. I should have included it, right? I have this great newspaper clipping. It's in the book from the Orlando Sentinel circa 1921, naming, like celebrating. Look at little Orlando, the dean of our little college, Rollins. If you've gone to Rollins, I don't mean that as an insult, right? The dean of Rollins has been named to the U.S. High Commission on Eugenics. And look at all the wonderful universities he's joining. Pennsylvania, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, every big school in the country wanted to be on that High Commission of Eugenics, right? This is science at the time. Newspaper accounts, radio shows are basically telling everybody who's not white, and in the 20s, that's not everybody who's white today, right? But telling everybody who's not white, look, you're impure, and if you mix with whites, you're making them impure, right? So this is a conversation that does disservice to not just the minorities being targeted, but I would also say to the whites who are sort of being misled to think that something like racial purity actually exists, right? Hint, it doesn't, right? Okay, so obviously I'm doing the academic thing here of interpersonal, structural, symbolic violence, right? We come up with all these new words and new ways of framing things that most of us actually probably have some way of understanding. And of course, even though as a scholar I'm disentangling these things to make sense of them, they never worked in solitary, right? They never worked alone. They were always mobilized side by side. So here's an extract from those 1871 Klan trials, right? This is an enormous amount of information. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of American citizens were called in front of Congress to testify on the Klan, right? Which at this point is not that old of an organization. And this is one. It's pretty hard to think about and read, so I'm going to summarize it as best I can. But this is one of those conversations where a man is talking about what happens when 2 or 3 Klansmen chase 2 or 3 African American men to the home of a white woman. And when they arrive and the African American men run flee, the white men don't chase them. They actually stay, and they drag the white woman from her home. And you can see here in the... you can actually see here... No, it's fine. You can actually see here in this interview, right, what they do is they proceed to tar and feather her, but in a most non-traditional manner. They actually turn her upside down and hold her by her ankles, and you can see here, underlined here, right, they pour it into her, and when asked to clarify, the witness says he poured it in her privates, right? So this is the sort of violence, right, that is interpersonal, unmistakably. But structural factors, right, like the legal establishment, the fact that these Klansmen probably were law enforcement, right, the structure of American society protects them. They don't have to worry about going to jail for this. And then, of course, symbolically, this sends a clear message to white women, African American men, basically anybody who would sort of help the marginalized or the disenfranchised, that won't stand, right? So this is a powerful way, and it's why when you see things like nooses being used, I hope we haven't forgotten about Jenna, Louisiana in 07 and these events, right? When people use a noose, right? It's not funny. It's a symbol, right? So that's a form of symbolic violence, but it's made palatable. It's made tangible, and it's made real because of the actual history associated with that physical object, right? So I'm going to zip past this one. This is like me really being an academic and trying to sound intelligent, which I'm not very good at. But basically looking at these three forms of violence, right? And thinking about them as tactics that can be selectively chosen, right? So as an anthropologist, I would call this bricolage, right? Taking from the available things and cobbling together a reaction. So in this case, the problem is enfranchisement, right, of minority communities. And the solution is to choose at varying times throughout U.S. history different forms of violence to disenfranchise those communities. So we can see this actually unfold across the 20th century up until today, meaning something like a noose today, a racial slur today, but also all the structural inequalities, higher incarceration rates of African American men, on and on and on, right? These are tangibly and real in their connections to events like the 1923 Rosewood race riot and lynchings and all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of similar events that took place in our nation. Okay, so now I'm going to switch. That's our theory, right? We can relax now. We don't have to. I don't have to think anymore. No. But we can start to think about the actual methodologies, right? So unlike some archaeologists, I don't think archaeology stops at what I dig up out of the ground. I know a lot of other archaeologists agree with that. But as a historical archaeologist, right, I have a lot of data I can bring to bear on a problem. So I have always responded to historical archaeology's sort of three realms of evidence. Artifacts make, right? It's archaeology. Of course, we have stuff we pull out of the ground sometimes, right? But also documents, right? As a historical archaeologist, I can make use of documents. It's something that historical archaeologists don't necessarily do well a lot of the time, but we could do a lot better. We're going to see how this is useful in a place like Rosewood, where there's no maps, city directories, it's rural, it's never incorporated. We don't even know what the town looked like in terms of who lived where or anything like that. Also, oral testimony, right? We can actually talk to, if not the people who lived at the places where we're doing archaeology, their descendants, their grandchildren, or at least their communities who are being impacted by those historical legacies. So one of the first steps is to start gathering all of this historical information. So in Rosewood, this is things like historic deeds, literally hundreds of them, right? If you've ever read a historic deed or tried to decipher what passed for handwriting 100+ years ago, I can write cursive. I know a lot of people make fun of certain age groups for not being able to do that. You wouldn't be able to read it at all, I guarantee you. But working with this data set, being able to then convert the metes and bounds descriptions into a map that represents hundreds, if not thousands, of properties as they're traded back and forth over a 2 square mile area that represents Rosewood, and then connecting things like census data to it, allows us to do a different kind of archaeology, what a lot of people have called documentary archaeology. Because even historians aren't using documents in this manner very often, right? Pairing them up with computer mapping software, GIS. So here's just one example to show the types of information this can reveal. So this is the McCoy farmstead. And you can see here a deed when this farmstead was bought, or I think 1900, 1901. It's bought at a rate, it's bought by a family, the McCoys, and you can see them here in the 1920 census, just a few short years before the riot. And it's an African-American family. They live on 150 acres of property, right? 1923 occurs. They leave, like so many other families. And then their property isn't bought by locals because they fail to pay property taxes, right? In fact, very few properties in Rosewood were lost for unpaid property taxes, right? This is sort of a common myth about Rosewood and what happened. In fact, the last African Americans to sell their property in Rosewood didn't do so until the 1950s, right? So this is a sort of previous idea that we can start to address in a very real way with this information. But with this specific example, what happens is 4 months, May of 1923, this is actually purchased by a couple local whites at a rate of $2.90 an acre. And then less than a year later, they subdivide it into 3 tracts. And they sell those each at a rate of $10 per acre, right? And yes, land speculation is taking place, but it is not that level of increase over that 9 to 10 months, right? So obviously, even though they are selling their property, they're not getting anything like a fair deal for it. And so that is a type of land grab, but it's operating in a much more personal way than people fled, didn't pay taxes, and locals picked it up. This is actually something that continues to affect these families for a generation or more. Okay, so I'm not going to go into this too much detail, but obviously all of this documentary evidence lets us talk about all sorts of other interesting things. So some trends I think that are very important, and I think their importance becomes sort of obvious when we're aware of them. African Americans in Rosewood owned their own homes at rates 2 to 3 times that of African Americans elsewhere in Florida, the Southeast, or across the nation as a whole. Simultaneously, that neighboring town of Sumner, which is basically a sawmill town, basically a company town, the individuals, the whites living there, owned properties at rates that were half or a third the rate of whites elsewhere in the state, the region, or the nation. So you have this huge, in a very real sense, wealth disparity, at least in terms of property ownership, between the local white and black communities. And of course, that's because African Americans in Rosewood had been living there for generations, and the whites show up a few years before this as part of a company town. Right? Also, this shows various careers, various jobs. And what's really interesting is Sumner is a company town. It's a sawmill. It's one economy, right? And it's all attached to that sawmill, which 10 or so years after this mysteriously burns, as most sawmills did at the time, generating a large insurance payment for the family, likely insurance fraud. But when you look at Rosewood, up to and just before the event, it's a mixed economy. You have people doing things like market gardening, turpentining, naval stores, so producing timber and turpentine for the naval industry, gardening, all sorts of things, right? I think that's part of the reason why Rosewood was weathering certain other economic difficulties. When you have a mixed economy like that, things like even orange groves that were still growing that far north in Florida, all of these things, right? Each family gets to diversify in a very real sense. And that produces, right, that type of economic diversity always makes for a much stronger community. Oh, also, it's not charted up here, but African Americans in Rosewood hired teachers, paid for a schoolhouse because, right, the state wouldn't pay for a black schoolhouse, and were educating their children 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years longer on average than their local white neighbors, right? So there was a real investment in what today we would understand to be, if they had maintained it or been allowed to, intergenerational wealth, right, would have been produced here, and it wasn't, right? It was never given, this community was never given that opportunity. So, now we'll get to some archaeology, right? We have been doing archaeology. These are some of the modern property boundaries and some of the places where we've been doing archaeology. For various reasons, we get access. This is all private property. The state, the federal government, none of these entities own property in Rosewood. So we're still having to get access from private landowners, which can be, politely put, hit or miss. Some property owners out there are very eager to have us do this sort of work. Others don't really care. They don't care about the story. They don't want to be a part of it. They just want to have their country home and sort of get out of the city. That's a lot of people who live here actually didn't even move to the area until the 70s or 80s. And quite frankly, they didn't know what they were buying. They didn't know they were buying a piece of Rosewood. They didn't know what that meant. And then, of course, a third group of property owners are actively hostile to this work, right? So we have received threats when we're doing this sort of work. People, in fact, some of the neighboring property owners where we've been doing archaeology have made it very clear in very threatening manners that we should not come onto their properties, right? So these are also parts of the people who deny it ever took place, right? So like other large-scale violent events, you have your deniers, right? So we've uncovered a lot of interesting things. One of the first places we did work was at the site of the Masonic Lodge, and it's a black and African-American Masonic Lodge. It's called Magnolia Lodge. We had the property deed for it. We know it was constructed. So we did archaeology here. We were able to discover where it is. All of that that computer mapping with deeds and census and everything else acts as what we would call a predictive model. And it actually gives us, usually within 10 to 20 meters, where a structure existed. We've tested this now numerous times, and it's doing a really good job of pointing us to where structures existed. So just a couple artifacts here. This one is a medicine, really like a druggist or prescription bottle. These were really popular in the late 1800s through the early mid 1920s, 1930s. Really common items that were produced, sort of mass scale production. And it's hard to make out here, but this is the same bottle. It would have been similar to this, the neck and the lips a little different, but you can see here the shoulder and the neck, it's pristine. It's fragmentary, but it's pristine. The one next to it, which I know is hard to make out here, is actually pitted, deformed. It's really messed up. So this artifact actually came out of the refuse pile, right? The trash pile that's about 20 or so, maybe 30 meters away from the historical footprint of the Masonic Lodge. This one came out from where the Masonic Lodge would have been located and burned. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a deformation of this artifact, this glass artifact, because of the intense heat generated during a structural fire. And that's the type of heat you would need to have generate a forest fire where the heat is sort of lost upwards. A structure fire, as it collapses, actually pushes that heat back into the ground. I had to ask foresters about this because I don't actually know that much about structural fires. I've set many on fire. No, I'm kidding. This is going on YouTube, right? No, but I didn't know anything about that, right? So it was really useful. And of course, this is fascinating for an archaeologist because we often want to talk about events. And here's an artifact that speaks to a specific event, right? This is not a common form to find this artifact in. And we've found fired bullets that have been deformed also at this site, deformed from impacting, impacting structural elements. We found a mix of ceramics, which we associate with a community center, right? There's no sort of match plates here. Imagine A Masonic lodge would serve a purpose similar to a church. It would be open to the community at certain times. People would come, they'd have picnics. They do community-oriented things here. And the artifacts we're finding are, sort of testifying to that aspect of this site. So, we've got these structures. We've been able to relocate most of them on the landscape using various methods. We haven't tested all of these locations. We are hoping to do more testing in the coming years. We have a grant that I'll talk about in a moment from the state that's allowing us to do more of this work. But what's really interesting, remember back to that history, that first week of 1923, when I talk about the Carter household, part of this story, right, is that the assailant is taken out of the area by African Americans in Rosewood. Sam Carter supposedly does this because he's a Mason and the assailant is a Mason. That actually is all true. The difference is Sam Carter is an African American Mason and the assailant was a white Mason. And even though they were segregated institutions at the time, people often honored that across the color line at an interpersonal level. So institutionally, you're not desegregating the Masonic lodges, but interpersonally, there is cooperation at the individual level. And so when they approach Carter and he says, I can't tell you where the black assailant went because it was a white assailant, and they kill him, what they're doing in effect is silencing a witness, right? And then the next time they come into town, right, they approach the Carrier household, right? And so this is Sumner down here. They have to go all the way through the vast majority of Rosewood to get to the Carrier household. And the part of the story I didn't mention before, the reason we know it was a white assailant and not an African American one is because Sarah Carrier and her granddaughter Philomena were laundresses or washerwomen who worked in Sumner, worked for the Taylors, and were present at the time when Taylor's extramarital lover left after attacking her, after their altercation. 2 more witnesses to the fact that this is a white assailant. Silenced again almost immediately when violence is reignited, right? And so that's what we see here, thinking about the madness of crowds, the feverish behavior of these groups. This is a group that behaves in a very calculating manner, right? And I think that's troubling to think about and realize, but I think it's very important to recognize, right? That's what these events were doing in this case, right? Literally silencing witnesses. Okay, so now I'm going to end. I know I just have a few more minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up quick. Obviously, one of the reasons we've been able to do work in Rosewood is we've explored other technologies, other methods, right? Like virtually reconstructing the entire town. This is something I've done years ago. I'm hoping to update in the coming years. This is actually just screenshots of what this looked like back in 2007. So it's deeply shameful to see how primitive this looks. No, I'm kidding. No, but it's come a long way since those early incarnations back in 2007 and 2008, right? So we've started to reconstruct this community. We now have a 3D virtual version of the entire town. This is also being paired with things like digital storytelling, digital documentaries. So this grant that I have from the Florida Department of Historical Resources, that's a plug, I guess, we're also making a documentary. That's part of the grant, is to fund a documentary that will then be made available to public broadcasting stations across the state, right? So we get to use oral histories like this one by Robbie Morton, who died 2 or 3 years ago, but she was alive when I started this research. This quote here, I won't read it for verbatim, but basically this is a really powerful story. Early in that week when Rosewood was destroyed, Robbie's father recognized violence could very well reignite. So sent Robbie and her older sister away. And over the coming days and weeks that followed, they didn't hear from their father. They assumed he had died or been killed. They travel further south, eventually ending up in Riviera Beach, just north of Miami, where they go to a new chapel, an AME church that's been built by the Hearst Foundation. And unbeknownst to them, or presumably their father, there sitting in the front row is their father, who they write have this sort of, you can imagine, this tearful reunion. None of them had any idea they were alive or where they were, and yet they re-encounter each other months later. Right? So that's the sort of stuff that we can talk about with these digital documentaries. And of course, we've continued to use this information. We're updating the virtual worlds, making them more engaging, right? And all of that work is actually producing much more engagement in Rosewood, including access. We've now had access for several years to the African American cemetery, which is on private property. This is not unusual with historic cemeteries for them to end up that way. And so we've been doing various work documenting this. And what's really fascinating is this landowner has always opened his property to the descendants of the people born there, right? Buried there. This is a white landowner who is very much taken his responsibility as a steward, seriously. And so some of these families actually left Rosewood in the years before it was destroyed. So like the Goins. So this is one family, and this is a picture from 1905 in that cemetery following a burial, right? So this is the same cemetery we're working in, and we now have access to photographs, letters, all sorts of additional correspondence from the people who lived in Rosewood, because some of them left in the years before 1923 and were able to take their possessions with them. And we wouldn't have access to this information if we didn't have access to these sites and sort of the commemorative events and practices that are taking place without the archaeologist or the scholar or the academic being involved. But now we can talk about this in sort of a broader sense. So we've returned, right? We're doing more work. Here we were out just a few months ago doing shovel tests. We chose the hottest week of August to go out. And it was also one of the wettest summers in Florida's history, if you don't remember this, right? So we actually hit a site that was flooded. We had to spend a lot of time clearing new paths, so on and so forth. The trials of being an archaeologist. But we dug almost 60 shovel tests. We found very little. But we also did GPR mapping, so ground penetrating radar of this cemetery. And I just want to briefly here, so this is a radiogram. It's when you push the GPR unit across, it produces one two-dimensional representation of what in this case is about 2 meters down into the ground. And then we can match this with our mapping of the surface features. So when graves in this part of Florida and elsewhere sort of age, they collapse, they create very noticeable indentations. And so here you can see these 3 radar returns, right, that correspond to this line of graves, right? So what we're doing now, we're in conversations with the Archaeological Conservancy. We're trying to find a way to document the site, get it preserved, and then produce some sort of commemorative space, right, where people can come and pay their respects and understand what took place here. So I'll just skip through some of this stuff, right? We're starting to really think about how we produce a virtual experience where you can walk around this landscape and encounter the voices and experiences that we've collected through oral histories, right? So imagine walking to an area, walking virtually to an area and triggering the voice of a descendant or even a survivor. We have oral histories with both, telling you about my house looked like this, and that's what we're basing the Reconstruction on. I lived here with my family. All of these sorts of personal recollections that I think make history, honestly, if we want history to matter in the present, we have to make it emotionally impactful, right? And I think this is a really powerful way of doing that. So this work has led us to do all sorts of other projects. It's been a really useful learning experience. I'm just going to point this out because I think some folks may be interested in this. The Jewish cemetery in Nevis. Not everybody's aware that the Jewish history of the Caribbean is actually a very significant portion of that region's history. So this is a virtual reconstruction of that Jewish cemetery on the island of Nevis. You can walk around. When you click on these tombs, you get information. You get a transcription of the Portuguese that's typically written on them, who's buried there, when they were alive. Any information on the tomb is translated for you to interact with. Of course, many of you already know about this project. This is another project that came out, and we used a lot of our methods that we were using in Rosewood to help Uzi and others reconstruct some important maroon sites across Florida. Yeah, and I guess I should have chose Angola, but I don't know, this is a prettier picture, I think, isn't it? Okay, so that's it. That's all I have. I know I've probably run a little bit long. You can get the book if you don't get it here, right, for a discount. She won.
Did the descendants get any compensation?
So,
And the grandchildren?
yes, survivors, descendants did get compensation from the state in 1994. There was a large state bill to pay compensation. It also generated a Rosewood descendant scholarship for college. So survivors who were alive at the time got $150,000. And then the descendants got varying amounts, some of which, so imagine this, you're learning that your family is connected to this place, you're learning that your family lost all of this potential, and the state sends you a check for $11, $25. And that literally, there were amounts, they had this very weird math that they did to sort of, well, you're so far removed, the trauma your family has experienced, we think, is worth $25 for you individual, right? It's a really weird stuff. It did occur. People do cite it as a example of compensation or really reparations. But of course, the state and the lawyers who fought for this always argued this was compensation because the governor knew this was happening and took no action. So the state became culpable because it did not act. They don't think they could have won a case like this arguing for reparations. Yeah.
There's been some question as to how many people were actually killed.
So yes, this is obviously an important question. I have found no evidence that would conflict with the historians who did research back in the 90s. Basically an estimated death toll of 8. So that's 6 African Americans and 2 white or Anglo-Americans. Yep. Now there are people, of course, who suggest that there is a mass grave. The 1997 film ends with a mass grave scene. There are still lots of people who claim to know that this mass grave exists, where it's located. I have not, in nearly 15 years, ever gotten somebody to give me anything approaching a concrete lead. And I should mention that when this was becoming a big thing in terms of winding through the state legislation, 60 Minutes did numerous stories on this. Several federal agencies actually explored Rosewood on the ground, and they also could not find a mass grave. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. I can only say I have found no evidence of it. Yeah.
Another question about the house which exists there, owned by the shopkeeper. There's some discussion about making it into a historical site or something.
There is, so that's the J.M. Wright house. It is exactly that. The white store owner who harbored African Americans, basically guaranteed their safety, is on the market. There is a group, and I am a part of this, although I am in no way leading it. There is a group trying to purchase the property. My goal for that group would be to see it turn that property into a museum. Right now, my understanding is that group is divided about what they see as the vision for the property. And obviously something like a hotel or a bed and breakfast would not be something I could support, but those are the sorts of things that have been suggested. Right? He's had his hand up for a long time.
Thank you for this. I didn't know this story, actually. I'm thinking about another town that was founded about the same time, Eatonville in Orlando.
Yep.
And given the different kind of violence you talk about here, and that being a successful black town that continued to thrive, why do you think it described when something like this was going on? Was it not systemic violence in Florida? Was it anecdotal here in Rosewood, or?
I would say that so there's three sort of well-known black towns or neighborhoods around Orlando. Ocoee, which had the 1920 Election Day riot. Obviously, racial tensions there are not, I mean, they're present. Several African Americans were killed when they tried to exercise their right to vote. And then there's Paramore, which a lot of people aren't familiar with, but this is actually probably one of the older black communities in Orlando. If you go through Orlando today and you see, was it Camping World Stadium now? That's Paramore. When you drive through there and you see the Amway Center, that's Paramore. When you drive through there and you see UCF's downtown campus, which I work for UCF, that's Paramore, right? So Paramore is being systematically, gentrified's too kind of a word for it. I mean, it's being systematically torn apart. And so like in Florida during World War I, more black soldiers came out of Paramore than any other black community in the state. And so when I now get to Eatonville, it is successful, but I think it's partly successful because of its, at the time, its position relatively far away from what would be a downtown Orlando area. Of course, today, if you're driving through this, you see Eatonville signs off of I-4. But it is, of course, today it's a mixed community. People still want to think of it as a black community, but it's definitely mixed racially and economically. And so I think that economic mix is part of the reason it survived. But there are other communities that very few people know about. The community of Royal. This I'm going to ask. Anybody heard of the community of Royal? No, of course not, right? Not to be like a snarky, I know something. So if anybody, and I suspect many of us have driven up 75 to where it encounters the interstate or the turnpike, the villages are not far away. Right at that intersection, so if you're coming up 75 and here comes the turnpike, 44, we're like a Love's and the Wendy's, and I stop there all the time. 44 is actually the southern boundary of a historical black town called Royal that was settled in the mid-1800s. Probably has connections to some of those earlier maroon migrations that when they come down here and there's a group that heads a little bit back north, that's heading into the Withlacoochee area. That's this area. And so Royal today is still owned by majority African Americans who are descended from the original African Americans who got GLO grants, homesteads, all of this sort of stuff going back at least to the 1870s, if not earlier. And a railroad never went to Royal. And I think it's that ruralness, that extreme ruralness, that actually is a big part of the reason it survives to the present. And of course, today, it's threatened by new things, mainly development. The aforementioned villages is encroaching on a number of historic things all around the three counties. It's now sort of its tendrils are reaching into. So I would say that Eatonville is probably the exception. Mm-hmm. And then,
If you're in the Rosewood area, is there anything to signify the significance of the area? And what would that be?
there's a historical marker. So as you're coming down, Highway 24, out towards Cedar Key, you'll drive past this large house, the J.M. Wright House. It's a large 2-story white house, and there's a little, it's a black iron historical marker on the side of the road. It's on the south side of the road. There's a little concrete paved area to pull off and read it. And that was installed actually by descendants in 2004. Even Jeb Bush showed up to help launch this or install it. And it, I think, still retains the dubious distinction of the most vandalized historical marker in the entire state. Actually being torn out of the ground something like a half dozen times in the first 2 years it was installed. So this is a real story for a lot of people out there that generates a lot of real emotion, both negative and positive. And there are a lot of people out there who do want to have this conversation. I give public talks out there at least once a year. So I don't want to paint Levy County as like, oh, it's a bunch of racist people, right? There are some hateful people out there, like everywhere, but there's also a lot of people out there who do want to talk about this in an open and sort of profitable in the sense of like producing recognition, reconciliation, that sort of stuff.
One more question.
I don't want to choose. Oh, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Okay, so according to your research, 6 were killed over X number of days. That doesn't seem like a massacre.
Well, I don't call it, I mean, I guess I do call it a massacre. That is an editorial change the publisher requested, because it sells more books, I think. Have we stopped recording? Oh, so, yeah, I know. So I have actually, and I do call this in the book, I would consider this more of a pogrom. So like the Jewish pogroms in Russia in the late 1800s. So there are deaths. And I would consider it, less. I use the term massacre because it's become a popular, way to reference this. Also, race riot. But this is the conversation I have with people who talk about the mass grave. Right? At a certain point, how many lives or how much has to be lost for this to be meaningful? I think 6 people in an entire town. Some of these people are elderly and they're gunned down in their front yards. I forgot her name right now. She was on the. It'll come back to me. Massacre. It's one of the. How many? I don't know what's the cutoff. Does it have to be 100 people? 20? I get that massacre is a little sensationalist, but it is also when people discuss this event publicly. They either call it a race riot or a massacre. So we went with massacre to sort of connect this book. Right? If I called this the Rosewood Pogrom, people would be like, is this a Jewish community in Russia that called themselves Rosewood? I mean, probably not. They wouldn't make that mistake, but yeah, so that's part of it.
Well, and isn't the massacre the concept that they ran all these people out of the whole community? It isn't just how many people died.
That's part of it.
The massacre of the town.
And that's, yes, I'm going to take that and use it.
I mean, that's how I'm reading you. Tell me if I have.
No. I mean, that's why I've used the term pogrom, because that is, use of violence to displace a community based on difference fits this. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but.
We got one more thing to do.